Mm. I think that our presentation is a little bit more into the energy issues that has been to some extent raised by the last presenters. The session started more with the climate change and adaptation issues. And our topic was energy security and international competitiveness. We've decided to talk to do our research on a panel of a selected developed countries, and we've applied a trade theory modeling approach. Dr. Tomasz Napiórkowski was precisely responsible for the modeling part of our research. So probably when we talk about energy security and international competitiveness, all of you know that these are two hot topics that, raise at the attention of the policymakers, and both of them are very high on the policy agendas. The International Energy Agency has said that when it comes to economic and energy policy, both the energy security and the ability to compete on international markets are equal goals. Nevertheless, we decided to firstly check what's energy security, because I bet that as there are, I don't know, 17 people in the room, there would be more than 17 answers on what energy security might be. And quite honestly saying, nobody in the room would be wrong. And why is it? Well, the literature review confirms that the energy security idea is a difficult one. It's elusive, it's blurred, it's ubiquitous, it's complex, it remains poorly defined, it has no common interpretation. The exact definition is hard to give, as it has different meanings to different people at different moments of time. And here I use the example of Poland and Germany, so both countries in the European Union, neighboring countries that are the EU members, and thus cherish a similar values when it comes to economic and energy policy. And that's what, whilst you would observe the energy policy of both countries and the energy security strategies, you'll see that while Poland is trying to build its first nuclear power plant, Germans are trying with the Energiewende to shut down all nuclear power plants. When Poles are trying to diversify natural gas supplies, Germans are doing otherwise. They are rather focusing on a single supplier. And when we are, as Poles, trying to focus due to infrastructural issues on the coal production, which I said before is connected with the electricity generation facilities. Definitely Germans are doing also the coal exit. So two countries in the European Union, neighboring nations, similar values, but yet completely different ideas on what energy security at this point for them mean. We know also that this idea has evolved in time, and thus probably energy security for a German society would mean at this point more of the environmental issues. So that it would have definitely higher environmental component, while probably for Poles that would be more about the price stability and the price availability of their energy resources. So going back to the energy security debate, we know that the term is not clearly defined, the definition is widely disputed. The actual definition of energy security has not reached consensus yet, or there is little consensus. So summing that up, Ang and the others, they've estimated that between 2000 and 2013, there's been more than 100 papers that provided 83 different definitions on what energy security really is. Majority of them were focusing on so-called energy supply security. And this is very important because that to some extent will determine our next research. So when we, with this literature review, when we started to look what's the nexus between energy security and international competitiveness, we realized that majority of the works is actually focused on energy as an input factor. So so-called energy competitiveness idea that is visible, for instance, in the works of Lieber, Klein, or the practical assessment of different energy competitiveness in different countries in the one of the last McKinsey reports. More precisely, sometimes this energy competitiveness is related specifically to exporting industries, and thus it is influencing the export competitiveness of different regions. There are relatively few studies that focus on how energy security influences international competitiveness. So we found this as a research gap, and thus we decided to focus on that idea. But as you can see, majority of that works refer to energy security in, I would say, different aspects. A very interesting work of Nyga-Łukaszewska, I hope that I pronounced that well, is in which authors are saying that in majority of works, energy security international competitiveness nexus is treated through the energy availability dimension, which is not all when it comes to energy security. Because if you would think about that in the International Energy Agency's framework, you would rather hear about availability, prices, and the environmental footprint, right? So majority of works focus on supply security in the form of energy availability. Thus, in our research, we decided to go a little bit further on. So we focused not on the idea of supply security, but we decided to go for so-called demand security. And that's a phenomenon that it's relatively new. That dates back to 2013 and 2007, when the first works on demand security appeared. Quite an interesting description of demand security brings Romanova. And she distinguishes 5 different aspects when it comes to energy to demand security. So she says that this is about the degree of regulation on the consumer's market, namely meaning how much does the country that is importing energy intervenes in energy markets. So what's the level of, I would say, regulation? Then there's a degree of competition in export markets, which is connected with the fact how many exporters are actually allowed to sell the resources at a specific market. Then you have oil and gas consumption stability, which is, I would say, more about this supply security dimension when you think about how much of the energy is consumed, thus how much should be made available in the future. You have also the level of taxes that are imposed on fuels in importing nations in order to check with what kind of fuels the energy resource that exporter would be selling to the importer's market will have to compete. And last but not least, there's a price stability. So this red bubble, this red circled bubble in here, and this is dimension that we've decided to include in our research. So how we decided to operationalize that? So we've decided to go for something what to our minds seemed as a reasonable way of depicting price stability of energy exporters. So we've decided to use resource rents as a percentage of GDP. So that includes total natural resource rents, oil rents, and coal rents. All the data was derived from the World Bank database. And we've decided also to think about energy security in a form of the more composite index, and that was the Global Economic Institute's energy security risk index. When it comes to international competitiveness conceptualization, since we have already done it for energy security, so we are aware of the fact that international competitiveness, just as energy security, this is one of those concepts that cannot be easily conceptualized and thus operationalized. We've here depicted the definition of the ZANG, but we are aware that there's the way of looking at international competitiveness that Michael Porter is presenting, that IMD is presenting, or different other actual institutions that are specializing themselves in international competitiveness. So we've decided to go for a measure that is not very, I would say, controversial, and this is based on the Balassa's work, and that's the revealed comparative advantage index, and there's quite a, I would say, sense of compromise, I would say, and between the researchers, among the researchers, saying that the RCA is one of the measures on international competitiveness. So our research question was following: whether and if so, then how does the energy demand security affect international competitiveness? We've decided to use the research framework of Amoroso and the others. That's an approach in which the authors were comparing the Mexico's trade patterns vis-a-vis its main trade partners. That was done in an effort to check whether Mexico's trade pattern was following either a Ricardian productivity hypothesis or maybe more of the Heckscher all-in factor endowment theory. So there's this trade theory approach included in that a methodological framework. Our sample composed of Norway, Canada, Netherlands, and the US. So we've decided to compare all the countries just like in Amoroso's approach, Mexico was compared against its competitors. So Norway was compared against Canada, Netherlands, and US. These are all developed countries. This is a very homogeneous sample, and all of them are net energy exporters. Our research horizon was comprised of 20 years. This is from 97 to 2017. And we've accounted for 4 different methods, 4 different models that included 4 different, let's say, energy security aspects or energy security measures. So first one was this composite energy security index. The second was with the total natural resources rent, then with the oil rents and coal rents. And I don't know if Tom is still with us. Probably, Tom, are you with us or? Okay, so I need to go on.
Actually, Honorata, I still am. So sorry.
Yeah, so
yes.
Go on. I mean, that's the part on the models variable. So yeah.
Yep. Okay. So hello, everybody. I was able to put my students to work for a little bit. Okay. So we used relative review comparative advantage as our dependent variable, and then in addition to that, what we did was we included variables which accounted for relative resource endowment, and these resources follow the economic growth theories. First of which was obviously physical capital per worker. Second was human capital, and last was the relative labor productivity. Of course, as Honorata mentioned earlier, the first 2 correspond to the Heckscher resource endowment theory of trade, while the last one corresponds to the Ricardian productivity differential ones. Next slide, please. Okay, so in our model results, basically what we decided to do, instead of throwing all the variables at once, we have recognized that similarly to international competitiveness, it is very, very hard to find one measure for our energy concept. Therefore, in each model, we have decided to run one energy variable at a time to see if the results will differ depending on the measurement, on the way we measure our energy security. Because if that was the case, then we would have a measurement bias. However, as you will see, spoiler ahead, as you see, our results are very much consistent regardless of the model which we use and regardless of the variable which we use. Can we skip forward, please? Okay, so our results are very consistent, and fortunately they're very consistent. But unfortunately, in a bit to our surprise, one of the results was that energy security does not, in a statistically significant manner, impact relative international competitiveness of our studied economies. So this was a big surprise to us. Honorata will speak more about that since she's the energy expert, but I think we can all agree that in today's world with increasing energy prices, this result comes as a surprise. However, and I don't want to go into econometrics over here. If you will have questions at the end, you will have my email. Please email me. but we have tested the models for basically everything which they can be tested for, and the results came out consistent. When it comes to the results related to factor endowment, we have found that both relative physical capital per worker, as well as human capital and labor productivity, in a negative manner, impact the relative competitiveness of Norway and of other countries. Therefore, their source of competitiveness has to be somewhere else. So someone will say, well, this is a little bit strange. Why do you have, how come none of these variables in a positive manner impact the competitiveness? Quite the opposite, they impact in a negative manner. Well, I think that the result, we think that the result may be connected with what Honorata mentioned earlier, which is our measure of international competitiveness. So we're sure of our econometric procedure, we're sure of our background literature check. I think we just may have a little bit of measurement bias. Next slide, please. And I will give the floor back to Honorata. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Tom. So, well, when it comes to conclusions, this modeling approach brought us the first conclusion, which is the most important for us, such that the international competitiveness of the studied countries is not determined by energy demand security. If it's captured by this composite index or the energy rent. So it would mean that in case of countries like Netherlands, Norway, US, Canada, you don't have much influence of energy and the price of the exported energy and its prices on international competitiveness. Of course, you may say these are developed countries, with quite high GDP. So for them, this price stability is not of such a importance as it would be, for instance, for developing nations. And that might be the case. And thus we've actually comparing developed versus developing net energy exporters stipulated as a possible next research step. We also think that this study might fit into the general debate on the Dutch disease phenomenon, but the Dutch disease phenomenon which precisely affects developed nations. And of course, the Dutch disease phenomenon, which was brought by Corden and Neary roughly 40 years ago, was about how the resource endowment, specifically energy resources, can affect to some extent the competitiveness of nations, right? So what's going on with the production factors, what's going on with the resource and with the energy industry, what's going on with the manufacturing industry. And possibly one of the explanations for why this energy demand security does not explain energy competitiveness, to our opinion, lies in the explanation of the Dutch disease. And there's a very interesting work of Ramirez, Sendrera and Wirth, in which they are saying that a successful and well-developed oil and gas policy prevented Norway from contracting the resource case. Of course, these are institutions, and as has been highlighted by Sachs and Warner and Malum, the quality of the institutions, so the policy that is introduced in place, especially in Norway, is decisive whether the resource abundant country will or will not experience the resource chaos. So in our sense, whether the country will be to some extent overwhelmed by the energy industry, and thus its competitiveness will be affected maybe negatively. So in this sense, our study is a small, maybe, I don't know, if you agree with us, we are very happy to answer your questions, but maybe that fits into that debate. So apart from the research step that that I've just described, so comparing this developed versus developing net energy exporters, is maybe using different methodological approach. We thought that maybe to some extent using this Amoroso's approach and looking for this relative competitiveness idea might be difficult, especially in a very homogeneous group. So maybe we should use in the same group even a different methodological approach. So maybe different method with a similar group of countries, developed ones, maybe a panel, but maybe more of the export competitiveness, not that much of testing whether this is more into, that fits more into factor endowment theory of Hexerl or productivity differentials of the Ricardian approach. So these are our possible next research steps. Yeah, and with that, I think they would like to stop.